The air in La Lanterna was thick with the scent of garlic, old money, and fear. Antonio Moretti liked it that way. He sat at his usual table in the corner, a throne of worn leather and dark wood. From here, he could see the entire restaurant. The entrance, the kitchen doors, the anxious faces of diners who knew who he was and pretended they did not. They called him the Lion. It was a name earned over decades of silence and sudden, decisive violence. His empire was built on order. Every bottle of wine, every plate of pasta, every man who worked for him had its place. There were no surprises in Antonio's world. Surprises were for the weak. Tonight, the veal was perfect. The Barolo was breathing just right. His man, Silvio, stood like a statue by the wall, his eyes scanning, ever vigilant. Everything was as it should be. Routine was a fortress. He finished his meal and placed his fork and knife together on the plate. Precisely at a 20-degree angle. The signal. A busby, a boy no older than 17 with panic in his eyes, scurried over to clear the plate. He moved with the terror of a mouse in a lion's den. Antonio ignored him. He reached for his napkin. It was a ritual. The crisp, white linen. He would fold it once, place it beside his empty wine glass, and then he would leave. The same way, every Tuesday and every Friday, for 15 years. But the napkin was wrong. It was not folded. It was not a simple, clean square. It was a shape. An animal. A clumsy, lopsided swan. Antonio stared at it. The world, for a single, frozen second, tilted on its axis. A swan. In his restaurant, on his table. A piece of childish foolishness in the heart of his perfectly ordered universe. His eyes, dark and hard as river stones, lifted from the table. He scanned the room. The busboy was already gone, practically having sprinted back to the safety of the kitchen. The other waiters kept their distance. The manager, Luca, was sweating, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. Then he saw her. She was new. Young, too thin, with dark, haunted eyes and a worn-out uniform that seemed a size too big for her frail frame. She was pretending to wipe down a distant table, but her movements were stiff, her knuckles white where she gripped the rag. She was not watching him, but he could feel her fear like a physical force. It radiated from her in waves. She was the one. The source of this? Chaos. This origami bird. Silvio, ever attuned to his boss's moods, took a half-step forward. His hand twitched toward the inside of his jacket. Boss? Something wrong. Antonio did not answer. He simply raised a single finger from the table. A small gesture. A command. Stop. Silvio froze, his posture relaxing but his eyes remaining sharp. He understood. This was not a problem to be solved with force. This was something else. Antonio Moretti looked back at the napkin. The swan's neck was crooked. One wing was higher than the other. It was a pathetic, desperate-looking thing. It was a message. He knew it in his bones. In a world of guns and whispers, of threats veiled in politeness, this was the loudest scream he had ever heard. A young woman, a nobody, a ghost in the machine of his life, had just risked everything to put a folded piece of cloth on his table. The question was, why? What was she trying to tell him? And who was she so afraid of that this was the only way she could speak? Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power, courage, and the silent promises we make to protect each other. If you enjoy stories that find hope in the darkest of places, please take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below and let us know what city or country you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. Antonio Moretti's world was governed by a set of unwritten, unbreakable laws. His laws. They were simple, forged in the poverty of his youth and tempered in the fires of his rise to power. Respect is earned, not given. Loyalty is a bond of blood. A man's word is his only true currency. But the first, the most sacred, was a law that stood above all others. You do not harm the innocent. Civilians, women, children, they were outside the game. They were the world his business operated in, but they were not part of it. To violate that rule was to invite a wrath that was biblical in its totality. It was the one sin Antonio would never forgive, in himself or in others. He had built a wall between his life and theirs. A high, thick wall of money and intimidation. He was the monster who kept other monsters at bay. That was the bargain he had made with his own soul a long time ago. He sat there, in the quiet opulence of his restaurant, and felt that wall tremble. The girl, the maid, was innocent. He could see it in the hollows of her cheeks, in the way she flinched when a plate crashed in the kitchen. She did not belong here. She was a sparrow that had flown into a cage of wolves. He thought of his own mother. He remembered her hands, chapped and red from scrubbing other people's floors. He remembered the smell of bleach on her clothes and the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones but never touched her eyes. She had taught him about order. About dignity. Even when we have nothing, Antonio, she used to say, her voice firm, we have our pride. A clean floor, a neatly made bed, a properly set table. These are not small things. They are how we tell the world we are not animals. A properly set table. He looked at the swan again. It was an insult to his mother's memory. A deliberate act of defiance. Yet, it was not born of disrespect. It was born of terror. He could feel it. This was not a challenge to his authority. It was a plea to it. Silvio, he said, his voice a low rumble. The girl. The new one. I want to know everything. Already on it, boss, Silvio replied, his voice barely a whisper. He had his phone in his hand, his thumb tapping out a message. Silvio was more than a bodyguard, he was an extension of Antonio's will. He anticipated needs before they were spoken. Antonio motioned for the check. Luca, the manager, scurried over, his face a mask of professional terror. He avoided looking at the napkin, pretending it didn't exist. Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Moretti? Luca stammered. Antonio's eyes locked onto his. The service was memorable, he said, the words hanging in the air. He placed a stack of $100 bills on the table, far more than the meal was worth. It was his custom. Money was another tool, a way of ensuring silence, loyalty, and the best table. But tonight, he did something different. He took one of the bills and, with slow, deliberate movements, folded it into a small, tight square. He placed it directly on top of the crumpled swan. A new message. An answer. I see you. As he stood to leave, he allowed his gaze to drift toward the young woman. She was watching him now, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and heart-stopping fear. He gave her the slightest of nods. A gesture so small, anyone else would have missed it. For her, it was a lifeline. Walking out into the cool night air, the city lights blurring around him, Antonio felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. It was the feeling he got before a storm. The hunt. Someone in his organization, someone close to him, had broken his most sacred rule. They had dragged an innocent woman into their dirty games. They had used her fear as a weapon. And now, he would find them. He would dismantle them. He would remind them, in the most permanent way possible, why he was called the Lion. The information came back before his car had even reached the bridge. Silvio read from his phone in the passenger seat, his voice flat and professional. Her name is Elena Petrova. 26 years old. Widow. Husband, Stefan, died 6 months ago. Construction accident. No payout, company went bankrupt. She has a son. Leo. 5 years old. Antonio stared out the window at the dark, swirling water below. A widow and a son. The story was as old and as tragic as time itself. She works 2 jobs, Silvio continued. This place at night, a cleaning service during the day. Lives in a one-bedroom apartment in the Heights. Landlord is a slug named Kowalski. He's been leaning on her for the rent. The report says she's 3 months behind. Every word was a nail in the coffin of his calm. He pictured her, running from one job to the next, her body aching with fatigue, her mind consumed with worry for her child, for their next meal, for the roof over their heads. He saw the desperation that would lead a woman like that to risk everything on a folded napkin. Who would have leverage over her? Antonio asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Anyone, boss, Silvio said grimly. A woman like that, she's invisible. And she's vulnerable. A threat against her job, her apartment. Her boy. It would be enough. Her boy. The words echoed in the silence of the car. Antonio's hands clenched into fists on his lap. He remembered being a boy himself, watching his mother grow thinner and more tired with each passing week. He remembered the fear that lived in their tiny apartment, a constant, unwelcome guest. The fear of hunger, of sickness, of being thrown out onto the street. He had sworn then, as a powerless child, that he would never feel that way again. He would build a fortress of power so high that the world could never touch him or his. And in many ways, he had succeeded. He was no longer that helpless boy. He was a king in his own kingdom. But the memory was always there, a ghost inside him. Elena's fear was his mother's fear. Her son, Leo, was him. This was no longer business. It was personal. Watch her, Silvio, Antonio commanded. From a distance. I want to know who she talks to. Who looks at her? I want to know who is breathing down her neck. Use the new men, the ones nobody knows. And the landlord? Kowalski? Have someone pay him a visit, Antonio said. A conversation. Remind him of the importance of compassion. And tell him Elena Petrova's rent is paid. For the next year. He'll ask questions. No, Antonio said, a grim finality in his tone. He won't. He leaned his head back against the leather seat and closed his eyes. The image of the swan filled his mind. It was a symbol of grace and beauty, but he knew the truth about swans. They were fiercely, violently protective of their young. They would fight to the death to defend their nest. Elena was no different. She was a swan, fighting in the only way she knew how. She wasn't just warning him of a threat to his life, she was protecting her own nest. Someone had threatened her son. A cold, precise rage began to build in Antonio's heart. It was an old friend, a tool he had mastered long ago. He let it rise, honing it to a razor's edge. He didn't know who the traitor was yet. He didn't know the specifics of the plot. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had made a fatal mistake. They had crossed a line that should never be crossed. They had mistaken his silence for weakness, his code of honor for a lack of brutality. They had shown him their hand. And now, he would show them his. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent, invisible warfare. Antonio went about his business as usual. He held his meetings, collected his tributes, and maintained the placid, unreadable expression that had served him so well for 40 years. On the surface, nothing had changed. Beneath the surface, his entire organization was in motion. Silvio's men, ghosts in the city's fabric, became Elena's shadow. They watched from unmarked cars, from across the street, from the rooftops. They documented every person she interacted with, every nervous glance she threw over her shoulder. They were looking for the shepherd. The one holding her leash. Antonio himself focused on his inner circle. He held court at his social club, a dimly lit den of cigar smoke and whiskey. He watched his capos, his lieutenants, his most trusted men. He listened not to what they said, but how they said it. He looked for the flicker of deceit in their eyes, the tremor of a lie in their voice. His gaze fell most often on Marco Vettori. Marco. The Viper. Young, ambitious, slick. He was the son of an old ally, and Antonio had taken him under his wing, grooming him for leadership. But Marco was impatient. He saw Antonio's deliberate pace as hesitation, his code as a weakness of old age. He smiled too much, and his eyes were always hungry. During a meeting about port logistics, Antonio watched him. Marco was sharp, as always. He had the numbers, the details. But he was trying too hard. His confidence was a performance. And twice, when he thought no one was looking, he checked his phone. A quick, furtive glance. It was a small thing. A crack in the facade. But Antonio's world was built on noticing the small things. That night, he returned to La Lanterna. He took his usual table. The restaurant was buzzing with a nervous energy. Luca, the manager, looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. Elena was there. She looked even more fragile than before. There were dark circles under her eyes. But when she approached his table to pour his water, there was a new resolve in her expression. She had seen his message, the folded bill. She knew he was listening. She did not speak. She did not have to. As she set down his bread basket, her hand brushed against the saucer of his espresso cup. When she pulled away, a single sugar cube sat on the saucer, just slightly offset from the center. Antonio's eyes narrowed. It was another message. So subtle, so insignificant. Anyone else would have thought it was an accident. But Antonio knew better. He knew the history of every family, every crew in the city. The Vettori family, Marco's family, had built their initial fortune on sugar imports, back in the old days. It was their symbol. Their history. The sugar cube was a name. Marco. The confirmation settled in Antonio's gut like a block of ice. It was not a surprise, but a deep, profound disappointment. He had seen the boy grow up. He had trusted him. Betrayal from an enemy was business. Betrayal from family cut deeper. He finished his meal in silence, his mind a whirlwind of strategy and cold fury. Marco had made two mistakes. First, he had decided to move against him. Second, and far more grievous, he had involved an innocent woman and her child. He had used the threat of violence against the helpless to orchestrate his cowardly plot. He had signed his own death warrant. When Antonio left the restaurant, he didn't leave a folded bill. He left nothing but an empty plate and a single, untouched sugar cube on the saucer. A new message. Message received. Back in the car, the silence was heavy. Silvio drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew. He didn't need to be told. Marco, Silvio said, the name tasting like poison. After everything you did for him. Ambition is a fever, Antonio said, his voice flat. It makes men blind. What's the plan, boss? Antonio looked out at the city lights, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing a chessboard, and he was planning his final moves. First, he said, we take the queen off the board. He turned to Silvio. I want Elena and her son moved. Tonight. Now. Take them somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever think to look. The old house by the lake. Tell her it's a paid vacation. Tell her anything you want, but get her and that boy out of the city. And Marco? Silvio asked, his voice hungry for the order. A slow, cold smile touched Antonio's lips. It was a terrifying sight. Marco loves money, Antonio mused. His greed is his weakness. We're going to set a trap. A big one. Something he can't possibly resist. He began to lay out the plan. It was simple, elegant, and brutal. He would call a special meeting. Just him and Marco. He would dangle the prospect of a new venture, a massive score that would make them both legends. He would make Marco believe that his betrayal had gone unnoticed, that he was still the trusted protégé. The meeting would take place at the old cannery warehouse down by the docks. A place of ghosts and memories. A place where many problems had been solved over the years. A place from which Marco Vettori would not be walking out. I want our best men, Antonio instructed. Hidden. Silent. No one moves until I give the signal. And the signal. Antonio reached into his pocket and pulled out the crooked, lopsided napkin swan he had taken from the restaurant. He smoothed it out on his knee. The signal, he said softly, will be the swan. The cannery smelled of rust and salt and decay. It was a cathedral of silence, vast and empty. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that pierced the grimy ceiling. In the center of the cavernous space, Antonio had placed a simple wooden table and 2 chairs. He sat in one, waiting. He was a patient man. He could outwait stone. He had arrived alone, a deliberate show of vulnerability. It was part of the trap. Let the mouse think the cat is sleeping. He heard the sound of Marco's expensive car crunching on the gravel outside, followed by the heavy groan of the warehouse doors. Marco strode in, flanked by 2 of his men. He was wearing a tailored suit and a confident smirk. The viper preening in his own perceived brilliance. Antonio, Marco said, his voice echoing in the huge space. A little dramatic, this place, isn't it? What's so important we couldn't discuss it at the club? Some things require a private setting, Antonio replied, his voice calm and even. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. Sit. Marco's men fanned out, their eyes scanning the shadows. Marco himself took the seat, leaning forward with an air of eager conspiracy. So, this new shipment. You said it's big. The biggest, Antonio confirmed. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But it requires trust. Absolute trust. He let the words hang in the air. He watched Marco's eyes. There was no flicker of doubt, only greed. The boy was already counting the money. Of course, Antonio. You know you can trust me, Marco said, the lie sliding smoothly from his tongue. Antonio stared at him for a long moment. He felt a pang of something akin to pity. The waste of it all. The potential, squandered on cheap ambition and a lack of character. Trust, Antonio repeated softly. It's a funny thing, Marco. You think it's built on grand gestures, on big scores. But it's not. It's built on the small things. On a word kept. On a rule observed. Marco's smile tightened. He was growing impatient. What is this, a lecture? Let's talk business. We are talking business, Antonio said. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket. Marco's men tensed, their hands going to their weapons. Antonio's hand emerged empty, except for a small, folded piece of white linen. He placed it on the table between them. With a flick of his wrist, he unfolded it. A swan. Crooked. Lopsided. Pathetic. Marco stared at it. For the first time, a flicker of confusion, then dawning horror, crossed his face. He didn't understand its meaning, not fully, but he recognized it as something out of place. A variable he hadn't accounted for. Do you know what this is, Marco? Antonio asked, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. It's a napkin, Marco said, trying to sound dismissive, but his voice was strained. This is a warning, Antonio corrected him. This is a prayer. This is the bravest thing I have ever seen. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Marco's. You went to a woman, a maid at my restaurant. A widow with a son. A woman with nothing. And you threatened her. You threatened her little boy, didn't you? Marco's face went pale. The facade of confidence shattered, revealing the coward beneath. I don't know what you're talking about. Her name is Elena Petrova, Antonio continued, his voice relentless. Her son's name is Leo. He is 5 years old. You told her that if she didn't help you, if she didn't become your lookout, your spy, that something terrible would happen to her boy. You used the most precious thing in her world as a weapon against her. The silence in the warehouse was absolute. Marco was speechless, his mind racing, trying to figure out how Antonio could possibly know. She couldn't come to me, Antonio said, his voice filled with a cold, righteous fury. She couldn't write a note. She couldn't speak a word. She was trapped. So she did the only thing she could. She folded a napkin. She broke my routine. She sent a signal, hoping the old lion was still sharp enough to see it. He stood up slowly, his shadow falling over Marco. You broke my rule, Marco, he hissed. The one rule. You brought the war to a civilian. To a child. You did this for money. For a position you were not ready for and did not deserve. You spat on the memory of your own father. You spat on everything we are supposed to stand for. Marco finally found his voice, a desperate, panicked squeak. You're old, Antonio. Your time is over. The world has changed. He lunged across the table, pulling a small pistol from an ankle holster. It was a foolish, desperate move. Before he could even raise the weapon, the warehouse erupted. From the shadows, from the catwalks above, a dozen men emerged, silent and professional. Silvio was the first to reach the table. A single, brutal strike disarmed Marco, sending the pistol clattering across the concrete floor. Marco's two bodyguards were neutralized before they could even draw their weapons. It was over in seconds. Marco was hauled to his feet, his arms pinned behind his back. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, animal terror. Antonio, please, he whimpered. It was just business. Please. Antonio looked at him, his face a mask of cold disgust. No, he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. This was never business. He picked up the napkin swan from the table and tucked it carefully back into his pocket. Take them away, Silvio, he ordered, turning his back on the pathetic, trembling man who had once been like a son to him. Make sure they understand the consequences of breaking the rules. The heavy warehouse doors groaned shut, plunging the space back into darkness. The narrative was clear and final. Marco Vettori and his disloyal associates had ceased to be a problem. They would not be bothering anyone, ever again. The threat was not just managed, it was permanently closed. Antonio Moretti walked out into the daylight, feeling the weight of the past 48 hours lift from his shoulders. Justice, his kind of justice, had been served. The house by the lake was small and quiet. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of pine and clean water hung in the air. It was a world away from the grime and fear of the city. Elena Petrova sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching her son chase a butterfly on the lawn. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she was not afraid. The men who had brought her here were polite, respectful. They had told her Mr. Moretti wanted her to have a vacation, to rest. She didn't believe it, of course. She knew this was something more. She had spent the last 2 days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then she saw the long, black car pulling up the gravel driveway. Her heart leaped into her throat. Antonio Moretti got out of the car. He looked different in the daylight. Older, more tired, but just as imposing. He walked slowly toward the porch, his eyes on her son. Leo, seeing the stranger, stopped his chase and ran to hide behind his mother's legs, peeking out with wide, curious eyes. Mr. Moretti, Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. She stood up, pulling Leo close. Elena, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Please, sit. He did not approach further, respecting her space. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, a giant of a man looking up at a terrified woman. It's over, he said simply. The man who was threatening you, he is gone. He will not trouble you or your son again. You are safe. Tears welled in Elena's eyes. Tears of relief, so profound they felt like pain. She sank back into her chair, her body trembling. Thank you, she choked out. I didn't know what else to do. He said he would. He would hurt Leo. You did the right thing, Antonio said. You were very brave. I have no money to repay you, she said, shame and gratitude warring in her voice. I have nothing. Antonio shook his head. He took a step closer, and his eyes were filled with a deep, ancient sadness. You are wrong, he said. You gave me something more valuable than money. You reminded me of what is important. You reminded me why I do what I do. I am the one who is in your debt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys and a folded piece of paper. He placed them on the porch railing. This house is yours, he said. The deed is in your name. It is paid for. There is also a bank account that has been opened for Leo's education. He will want for nothing. Elena stared at him, speechless. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. It was a fairy tale. From behind her legs, Leo, feeling the fear recede, stepped out. He looked up at the tall, grim-faced man. Children have a clarity that adults lose. They see the heart of things. Are you a bad guy? Leo asked, his small voice cutting through the emotional silence. Elena gasped, reaching to shush him, but Antonio held up a hand to stop her. He crouched down, a difficult, creaking motion for a man his age. He brought himself down to the boy's level, so they were eye to eye. The fearsome lion of the city underworld, kneeling before a 5-year-old boy. He looked at Leo, and then his gaze shifted to Elena, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Sometimes, Antonio said to the boy, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. But today I got to be the good guy. He looked back at Leo. I'm the man who keeps you safe. He stood up and pulled a simple, elegant business card from his wallet. It had no name, no title. Just a single phone number printed in the center. He handed it to Elena. If you or your son ever need anything, he said, his voice firm with the weight of an unbreakable vow. Anything at all. You call this number. You are under my protection now. For life. He gave them one last, long look, a look that held a world of unspoken history and pain, and then he turned and walked back to his car. Elena watched him go, clutching the card in one hand and her son's small hand in the other. The black car disappeared down the long driveway, leaving them in the quiet, peaceful sunshine. She was free. She was safe. A quiet maid and her little boy, saved by a whispered warning and the unexpected honor of a dangerous man. Years passed. The city changed. Faces came and went. Empires rose and fell like the tides. But Antonio Moretti endured. He grew older, his hair turned from salt and pepper to snow white, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. His legend only grew. They said he was indestructible. They said he saw everything. He sat in his office, a large, dark-paneled room high above the city. It was a fortress of solitude, a place of quiet power. The desk was immaculate, a vast expanse of polished mahogany. There were no papers, no clutter. Just a phone, a lamp, and 2 small items placed with geometric precision. One was a small, plexiglass cube. Inside, preserved like a precious artifact, was a crumpled, lopsided linen napkin, folded into the shape of a swan. Next to it was a small, framed drawing. It was done in crayon, the lines wobbly and uncertain, as only a child can draw. It depicted a huge, yellow lion with a magnificent mane. Standing safely under the lion's protective gaze was a small white swan and a little boy with a smiling face. Every year, on the same day, a new drawing would arrive by courier. The subject was always the same. The lion and the swan. The protector and the protected. Antonio would look at that drawing and the napkin, and he would remember. He would remember the terror in a young woman's eyes. He would remember the innocent question of a little boy. He had spent a lifetime building an empire of fear, but his greatest strength, his most profound victory, had not come from a gun or a threat. It had come from an act of kindness. It had come from a choice to listen to the quietest voice in the room, to protect the most vulnerable soul. In the end, true power is not the ability to command armies or to instill fear. It is not measured in money or in territory. True power is the courage to shield the innocent from the storm. It is the quiet resolve to be the wall against the darkness, to be the lion at the gate. It is the understanding that sometimes the most important message in the world can be delivered in the simple, silent fold of a napkin.